I'd like to give you a brief history of the Protestant Reformation. But before we go into the history of the Reformation, we've got to step back for a second. Martin Luther, who led the Protestant Reformation, was born on November 10th, 1483. His parents were Hans and Marguerite, and they were poor, your typical medieval family. Hans was a miner. He worked in the coal mines, and his mother carried wood on her back, and they were very strict parents. Now, what's important here is not necessarily the November 10th date, but the year, 1483. Martin Luther is born into a world that is starting to change. 1483, 10 years later, Christopher Columbus set sail. And then after that, more Spanish explorers started moving and exploring the New World. So there was an excitement in the European area. An excitement where the world was changing, the new lands across the seas. And the Roman Catholic Church was having to deal with this change. The Roman Catholic Church, for many, many years after the fall of Rome, was the only organization that provided any guidance, any leadership, because there were no governments, there was no organized law enforcement, there was no legal system at the time. And the church provided stability for people. Christianity provided that stability. And as we move into the years as Martin Luther is growing up, like I said, there was an excitement in Europe. The new lands over the seas promised riches and newfound wealth. So as we get into things, Martin Luther ends up going to school. He ends up getting his bachelor's degree, his master's degree in several subjects like rhetoric and history. So Martin Luther is well educated. But one thing that his father Hans wanted him to do was go to law school. Becoming a lawyer in those days was the pinnacle of your career, the best job you could get. And Hans and Marguerite both saved their money, working hard, literally from sun up to sundown, and they were able to send their son, Martin, to law school. And then that's where the story begins to take shape. Now, there's a story in the book of Acts written by the Apostle Paul called The Road to Damascus, where the Apostle Paul talks about his conversion to Christianity. And Martin Luther has a road to Damascus moment. Paul's moment was he was going down the road and he sees a bright light and he hears a voice that says, "Why are you persecuting me?" And then Paul questions this. Where is this voice coming from? And he hears, "I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting." And with that, Paul became a Christian. He changed his name from Saul. He was a typical hedonistic Roman. And he changes his name from Saul to Paul. Martin Luther has a road to Damascus moment. Luther was coming back from law school one night, and there was a thunderstorm. Now, this must have been one whale of a thunderstorm because lightning's popping all over the place. And he throws himself down on the ground, and he says, "God, if you will save me, please save me, Lord. If you save me, I'll dedicate my life to you." Well, the next day, Luther does just that. He sells all his worldly possessions, gives away everything, gives away his money to the poor, and he joins the church. And he became a monk on July 17th, 1505. Now, for the next couple of years, Luther's life is pretty much dedicated to the monastic lifestyle. Reading the Bible, prayer, and study. Luther becomes an expert on the Bible. And he eventually gains his bachelor's degree in theology, his master's, and then his doctorate. And he becomes an expert. He becomes one of the monks in his cloister that understood the Bible. But you have to keep one thing in mind about Luther. He was a lawyer by trade. He had started law school. And this brings us to another event. In 1509, the Christian humanist Erasmus writes a book called The Praise of Folly. And in that book, he criticizes the Roman Catholic Church on 2 points. Now, you have to keep this in mind. You could criticize the church up to a point. There were things, though, that were out of bounds. Number one, you can't criticize the Pope. Number two, you can't criticize the church councils. Anything in between there, fair game. And Erasmus criticizes the church on 2 points. He says, number one, that the church should provide education in the works of Christianity. And another one, that the monks should not be so detail-oriented. And when you look at the Reformation, what Martin Luther does, he actually fixes what Erasmus criticizes the church on. Now, the Roman Catholic Church had run off the rails. They had become more interested in money-making. They'd become more interested in advancing their careers. And one of the big moments is the worship of the relics. During the Crusades, the knights who would travel down to the Holy Land would bring back relics from places like Jerusalem, Nazareth, and Bethlehem. And they would put these relics into the churches. One church claimed to have the leg bone of St. Peter. Now, if you look at this leg bone, St. Peter must have been 9 feet tall because it was the leg bone of a cow. But supposedly, if you went up and touched the leg bone, you would be healed and all your sins would be forgiven. And I often sometimes tell the story about the worship of the relics this way. During the Crusades, the Christian knights would go down there and fight the Muslims. And some of the knights would go to the outdoor markets. And in the Middle East, it's tradition to bargain. If you don't bargain, they consider that an insult. And I often tell my students this story. I want you to picture a knight riding down the road on his horse, and he comes upon a roadside market. And he gets off his horse, and he's got his armor on, and he sounds like a tin can factory walking around. And he walks up to the shopkeeper, and he says, "My good man, what do you have today?" And the little shopkeeper looks up and says, "Well, for you, Christian knight, I have something very special. Very special." And he reaches down and he pulls out a beautifully decorated case. And he says, "Christian knight, look." And he opens it up. He says, here is a piece of the cross that Christ was crucified on. I will sell it to you. And the Christian knight and the shopkeeper bargain. The Christian knight pays for the piece of wood, takes it back to his church there in France or England. And as the Christian knight rides off on his horse, the shopkeeper reaches under the table, pulls out his hatchet, chops off another piece of wood from something, pulls out another decorated box, puts it in there, closes it up, and waits for the next guy to come along. The church was worshiping relics. And there was something else they were up to as well. When the coffers would go low, when the church finances would begin to decrease, the church would ramp up the selling of the indulgences. Now, an indulgence was something that got you freedom from 100 years suffering in purgatory. See, what you have to understand is medieval Christians were taught from the day they were born until the day they died, they were going to be sinners and they were going to burn in purgatory for their sins. But you could get 100 years free from suffering in purgatory by purchasing an indulgence. What you were really purchasing was a piece of paper. And that was it. You see, medieval Christians were uneducated. They couldn't read the Bible for themselves like modern day Christians can. The Bible back in those days was written in classical Latin. It was not written in the vernacular. It was not written in the everyday common language. So they couldn't read for themselves that what the church was doing was selling God's forgiveness. That's what they were doing. And people would go to the churches, they would go in droves and buy these indulgences. This upset Martin Luther. And Luther went to his superiors and he said, we shouldn't be doing this. We're selling these indulgences. We shouldn't be doing this. And he had the evidence. See, here comes the lawyer in Martin Luther. He had the evidence in the book of Romans where it says we are saved by grace through faith, not by good works. And Luther used that as the basis of his argument. And the church superiors told him, Brother Martin, you need not worry with such trivial matters. See to prayer and study the Word of God. Well, basically what they're telling him is, go back and read the Bible. Well, what does Martin Luther do? He goes back and reads the Bible and comes up with more evidence. Well, finally, Luther realizes what's going on here. And he thought about his parents. His parents who worked themselves day in and day out to save money. And he realized other people were doing this too. And he realized that people were taking their hard-earned money and buying a piece of paper. So on the night of October 30th, 1517, Martin Luther sat down at his desk in the church there in Wittenberg where he was serving as the priest. And he wrote a list of 95 things that were wrong with the Roman Catholic Church. Now, I figure he probably could have gone a little bit further, but at 95, he stopped because he figured he might be pushing his luck. And then the next morning, on October 31st, 1517, he goes to the Castle Church in Wittenberg, Germany, and nails his 95 theses to the church door. Now, he nails it to the church door because back in those days, the church door served as the community bulletin board. If you had a prize pig you wanted to sell, you nailed that to the front door of the church. Well, Luther nails his 95 theses to the front door of the church so everybody will see it. But what he doesn't realize is this. Thanks to a little invention in 1455 by Johann Gutenberg called the printing press, somebody takes his 95 theses down, takes it to the local printer, and suddenly copies of Luther's 95 theses are now circulating throughout the Wittenberg area. And then out further from there. So much so that a copy lands on the desk of Pope Leo X. Pope Leo X reads this, and he tells his subordinates, he says, this little drunken German monk is intoxicated with himself. sober him. Basically meaning, you guys better get this fixed before it gets worse. Well, little did they know, it was getting worse faster than they could do anything about it. Because of the 95 Theses, the Roman Catholic Church now has a political situation on their hands. And it's starting to get out of control. So the church has to come up with a plan how to get out of this. Now, here's the thing. The Roman Catholic Church could have burned Martin Luther at the stake, which was the common form of execution for the church back in those days. They could have burned him at the stake at any moment, but they couldn't do it. In order to save themselves politically, to save face, they had to have Luther alive and kicking. So they had to ask Charles V, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, to make sure that nobody touched him right now, while the church formulated a plan on how to combat this. In the meantime, Luther's called to debate his 95 Theses with the noted Catholic theologian Johann Eck. Now, Eck was sent to debate Luther, but he was sent there with an ulterior motive. He wanted him to push Luther's buttons. See, Luther had a little bit of a temper. And Eck does exactly that. He pushes Luther's buttons, and Luther says that the church councils are made up of humans. Humans can make mistakes. Therefore, the church council can make a mistake. Well, that's out of bounds. That was one of the things you weren't supposed to criticize, the Pope and the church councils. He's already criticized the Pope in the 95 Theses. Now he's criticized the church councils. Well, the church now has come up with a plan. How we're going to fix the Luther situation. They called for a meeting called a Diet. The Diet was to be held in the city of Worms, Germany, in April of 1521. Now, let me give you a little historical connection here to what's going on. In 1521, Ferdinand Magellan will finish, or his crew will, he gets killed. His crew will finish their circumnavigation of the globe, the first man to do so. So when Magellan's crew arrives back, that adds to the excitement. Suddenly the world is getting bigger. And the Roman Catholic Church now finds itself getting pulled in several different directions. And this situation with Martin Luther is occupying part of their time. The Diet meets in the city of Worms. Charles V, the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, the new Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, he was 15 years old, 16, and he was your typical teenage boy. He really never paid any attention to what his daddy or his grandfather did, and he's taken over, he's the emperor of this great empire, and he really doesn't know what he's doing. Pope Leo X doesn't come because, well, he didn't have the courage to show up. So he sent a cardinal in his place. But the church has a plan here. They're going to bring Martin Luther into the Diet. And they're going to ask him one question. Now, the church officials have told Luther, we're calling you for a debate. So Luther arrives at Worms thinking he's going to debate the 95 Theses, plus the other writings that he has done. And when the lawyer that the church hired, and I've always thought it was ironic that they hired a lawyer to do this, the lawyer comes up after the meeting is called to order. And he asked Martin Luther, do you, Dr. Martin Luther, recant your teachings and writings? And Luther simply responds, he said, I can't answer that. I thought I was called here for a debate. Well, a discussion ensues. Now, you have to remember one thing here. This Diet does not convene until about 4:30 in the afternoon, because the night before, all the officials, all the church officials who had arrived in Worms, checked into their hotels and went to the local taverns. You see, there in the Holy Roman Empire, which will become Germany in 1871, the Germans have always prided themselves on their beer making. So all these guys went out and went into the bars, taverns, and got loaded. So the next morning, when the Diet convenes, they don't convene till about 4:30 in the afternoon because they're sleeping off their hangovers. Well, the conversation ensues. They're looking out the window and they can see it's getting about 5:30 in the afternoon. They've been in there for about an hour. Charles V was getting hungry and thirsty, and so was everybody else. So the cardinal says, "We'll grant you 1 day, then you will answer." And they dismissed the Diet, and they all went back to the bars and the taverns, except Luther. He goes back to his room that night, and he spends a night it was a very tortured night for him. He prays to God, and in some cases he cursed God because he was looking for guidance. He felt like he'd been abandoned. He kept praying to God and saying, "Give me guidance. I need your help, Lord." Well, the next morning rolls around, April the 18th, 1521. Luther comes into the hall there at Worms. They call the Diet to order, and the lawyer comes forth, and he asks the question, "Do you, Dr. Martin Luther, recant your teachings and writings?" And Luther has a reply. But the most famous line from that reply, he responds by saying, I will not recant. Here I stand. God help me. And with that, Luther walked out. Now comes a nice little string of events. Luther was leaving Worms to head back to Wittenberg. The church officials there in the area had arranged for a little accident to occur. They had hired some thugs to wait in the woods for Luther. And the plan was for these thugs to ambush Luther and kill him. That way, when it gets out later what happened, the church could legitimately stand back and say, "We didn't do it. We had nothing to do with that. We didn't have him executed. We didn't do it." In today's political world, we call this plausible deniability. Luther is on his way from Worms to Wittenberg when out of the blue, some men arrive. And these are men who work with Duke Frederick of Saxony. You see, Duke Frederick of Saxony was a secret supporter of Luther. And he'd gotten wind of the plan. So he sends his guys to kidnap Martin Luther. And they take him back to Wartburg Castle, where Luther is hidden away for the next 10 months. Now, you better believe when Charles V found out that Luther did not die, he issues the Edict of Worms declaring Martin Luther an outlaw and can be killed. Now, Luther sits in the bottom of Wartburg Castle. He's hidden away there. And he's not sitting there staring at four walls. He starts to do what Erasmus criticized the church on in his book. He took the Bible. I want you to imagine this. He took the Bible, chapter by chapter, book by book, and he copies it by hand, word for word, letter for letter. And when he would finish a book of the Bible, it would be smuggled out of Wartburg Castle, sent down to the local printer, where they would begin printing what Luther rewrote. Now, Luther was rewriting the Bible in the ordinary language. He was writing it into German. He was translating from the classical Latin into German. Now, you do this day in and day out, you're going to get tired. Luther took breaks. There were some days, probably several days in there, where he would take a break. So what does Luther do? He taught himself music. And throughout his remainder of his life, he will end up writing about 23 hymns. Well, Luther hides out there at Wartburg Castle for about 10 months. And he goes to Duke Frederick and he simply says, I need to go check on my family. I need to go back to Wittenberg. I haven't heard about my family. Well, Duke Frederick tells him, he says, look, you leave here, I can't protect you. Luther says, well, I'll just take my chances. I need to go check on my family. So they come up with an idea to try to protect Luther. They dressed him in a disguise. Now, this must have been the worst disguise in the history of disguises, because when Luther gets to Wittenberg, he's greeted by a welcoming party and a parade. They knew he was coming. Well, Luther arrives there in Wittenberg. Now, you might ask the question, okay, could the church officials go after him there in Wittenberg? Why don't they just go in there and get him? They couldn't. See, Luther was surrounded by his supporters, and his supporters kept growing day in and day out. So while they're in Wittenberg, Luther writes the large catechism to start fulfilling what Erasmus criticized the church on to begin with, not providing education in the works of Christianity. So, he writes the large catechism. Now, if we sat down to read the large catechism, it'd take you a couple of days. Pack your lunch. And later, Luther admitted that the large catechism was a bit wordy. So, he wrote the small catechism, scaled it down. Small catechism, you can sit and read, about 30 minutes. And there he explained everything from the Apostles' Creed, the Lord's Prayer, the Ten Commandments, the Lord's Supper, confessions, and baptism. Not only does he do that, but he wrote a new worship service in the common language, which will become the basis later for the Lutheran worship. He also encouraged singing. He thought hymns should be worked into the worship service, that hymns should be an integral part. So he incorporated church music, which is still a large part of the Christian church today. Luther's most famous hymn that he wrote was "A Mighty Fortress is Our God." And this hymn has kind of become the fight song for the Reformation. Luther will go on. He eventually will get married, which was a no-no for a Catholic priest. There were 3 nuns who were snuck out of a convent down the road from Wittenberg. Now, there's some conjecture, some debate about whether this actually happened or not. Some say the story is a little bit legendary and kind of fictional, and there's some other sources that say, well, this is how it happened. Anyway, these 3 young nuns, they escape from the convent and they get to Wittenberg. And they go to the castle church where Luther was serving as the pastor. And they go knock on the door. And Luther had a sidekick. Every great man in history has a sidekick. Luther's was Philip Melanchthon. Well, Melanchthon opens the door, and there stand these 3 dirty, smelly young ladies. And he tries to get rid of them. But Luther comes, bebopping through the church, and wants to know what's going on. And when Melanchthon introduces them, these girls fall at Luther's feet, and they say, how great man Luther is. Luther begs them to stand up. He doesn't like this. He wants to stand up, and he says, I'm just an ordinary man. humble before God. And Luther does the right thing. He takes these young ladies and he finds prominent homes for them there in the Wittenberg area. But there was one of them. One of them who developed a crush on Luther. And when Luther would lead a worship service, she was sitting right in the front row. When he would teach a class, she was sitting right there in the front row. And she continued to flirt with him. And eventually she asked him to marry him several times. And he turned her down. Now the reason he turns her down is Luther knew in the back of his mind that he was a target. He knew that at any moment somebody could kill him. And he didn't want any attachments. He didn't want a wife. He didn't want a girlfriend. He didn't want anybody attached to him because he didn't want the burden of their death on his shoulders. But nonetheless, this little nun doesn't take no for an answer. And she wears him down. And eventually, they get married. And Luther married Katharina von Bora. She becomes known as Katie Luther. They were married on June 13th, 1525. She was 26 years old. He was 42. Katie and Martin Luther will have 6 children, all of which some of them will pass away from various sicknesses, and some of them will live on. In the meantime, the Reformation begins to move on. Pope Leo X literally dies because of the Reformation. The stress of the whole thing kills the Pope. Charles V decides to make a bold move. He summons the 138 princes of the Holy Roman Empire who were Lutheran. He summons them to Augsburg. And there at Augsburg, these princes come in before the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, and he tells them that you will ban and burn these outlaw Bibles in the common language, and you will worship in the Catholic manner. And the Lutheran princes there on June 25th, 1530, basically tell Charles V, no, we will not. And they hand Charles V what becomes known as the Augsburg Confession, which outlined what this movement, what the beliefs were. And when Charles V read it, he couldn't argue with it. And the Reformation plowed on and grew. Other reformers will come after Martin Luther. And the historical implications of this are incredible. Later on, King Henry VIII of England will break away from the Roman Catholic Church and form the Church of England. That will affect the colonization of the United States. Christianity will change. The language of the day changed. And suddenly the Roman Catholic Church found itself in a world that had changed before their very eyes. Martin Luther died on February the 18th, 1546, at the age of 62. And he was buried in the most appropriate place, in the floor, underneath the pulpit, in the Castle Church, there in Wittenberg, Germany. A little bit later, his sidekick, Philip Melanchthon, will also be buried in the floor of the Castle Church there in front of the lectern, because it's Melanchthon that sat down and wrote the church liturgy. And that's the history of the Protestant Reformation.